Everybody, hopefully the audio is okay. Hopefully the signal is okay. I am on my way to Miami to go say hi to all the people who are flying into town to go on the SP Carnival cruise. I'm not going on the cruise myself, but I figured some of these people are traveling halfway around the world to go here. The least I can do is make the 4-hour drive from Clearwater down to Miami to hang out for a few hours, turn around, and drive right back to Clearwater. And since I've got about 70 miles of straight freeway until my first stop, and since these cars drive themselves anyway, I figured this is a safe stretch of straight stretch of freeway to kill a little bit of time and to do a little bit of chat. I went back through the community post I did a little while back asking people for questions they haven't had answers to yet, to see if I could do it any justice. And one question that I wanted to tackle is, given all of the abuses that we hear about from all the former Scientologists who are doing videos on YouTube and all that kind of stuff, why aren't there more people suing Scientology? And I figured this would be a good one to tackle because I can really just answer it from my own perspective as far as how it applies to me personally, and then maybe, explain some of the structural reasons why it is hard to sue Scientology, or it's hard to succeed in lawsuits against Scientology. I'll tell you, speaking for myself, if someone's like, well, why aren't you suing Scientology? I don't want to. I think the fact that there's a lot of people who simply don't want to be involved in litigation with Scientology is probably the biggest reason that more people don't sue Scientology. Because the structural reasons that exist that make it hard to sue Scientology, those reasons are applied to every former Scientologist. And so clearly, the former Scientologists who are suing Scientology, they're doing it despite the structural reasons. And so, again, speaking for myself, I have no interest in being involved in litigation with Scientology. Now, I'm happy for them to sue me, because if they want to sue me, then for whatever reason, whatever it would be. So what a reason Scientology could theoretically sue me. They could try to say I've had some NDA that I've signed in the past. They could try to say that I'm violating some non-disparagement agreement. Like, I don't even have any recollection of having signed any of those agreements. But when I was leaving the Sea organization, they pulled in both me and my wife separately into a small little cramped room in the security office with a Scientology attorney and multiple video cameras running to be asked questions by this lawyer on camera, whether it was true that I was leaving the Sea Org because I could not uphold the high ethical standards of the Sea Org. I'm like, oh yes, that's absolutely true. You'll say absolutely anything to get out of there. Is it true that as a Sea Org member you were always treated wonderfully? Oh yes, it was the best, 5-star, Ritz-Carlton treatment. This is like a luxury resort, living here on L. Ron Hubbard Way. And is it true that you've been here of your own free will? You could have left anytime you wanted to. Oh yes, absolutely. Everyone knows that. And then they have you sign these documents on camera. You're not supposed to read the documents. You're not allowed to have them reviewed or anything. And it doesn't even matter what the documents would have said. I would have signed them because I was intending to remain a Scientologist in good standing. A Scientologist in good standing never even dreams that they would ever sue Scientology, nor would they ever dream of wanting to retain the right to ever sue Scientology. Like, that's just not how a Scientologist thinks. So is it possible that the forms that I signed were non-disclosure agreements or non-disparagement agreements? It's totally possible. I just truly have no idea. But if Scientology would ever try to sue me for violating those things, well, then of course we get into discovery. And once you get into discovery, you get into depositions. The depositions would include anybody and everybody who could possibly attest to the truth of anything that I was saying that Scientology was suing me for. So I'm more than happy to have Scientology sue me. I also know that they would never do that for the reasons I just gave. But I would never personally in a million years voluntarily enter into litigation with Scientology. I just don't want that sort of headache in my life. And so for those that do, they are taking on quite a burden unto themselves. And I think that's admirable. But it's something that someone has to enter into with their eyes wide open, and understanding that statistically speaking, historically speaking, the chance of those lawsuits being successful are statistically low, which is also why right now there's 5, and this is not in any way intended to encourage people not to sue. If the more people that are suing, the better. But when someone asks that question, but why aren't there more people suing? I got to just be honest with the first and most obvious answer. I wouldn't even want to. I don't even know if I have something I could sue for. But if a lawyer came to me and said, "You've got a great case here," I don't even know that I would bother moving forward. I feel like I get my own justice on YouTube every single day of my life, and I make Scientology pay in my own way every single day of my life, and that's good enough for me. So there's 5 lawsuits currently open, ongoing, against Scientology and David Miscavige. 3 of those have basically been derailed, and 2 of those are moving forward quite nicely. Now, I think also when this question gets asked, why aren't more people suing Scientology? There's 2 different things here. There's civil lawsuits, and there's criminal proceedings. And the Danny Masterson trial, for example, that was a criminal proceeding. That was the state, that was the government criminally going after Danny Masterson. Scientology got brought into that as well, rightfully so. It was amazing. But I'm mentioning the difference between the civil and the criminal here is because one of the reasons the reasons why you don't see more civil lawsuits, more litigation, is a different reason than the reasons why you don't see more criminal prosecutions. For the criminal cases, that requires the government to want to do something about it. And that is a higher bar to clear than finding former Scientologists who want to do something about it. There's political considerations that enter into the calculation when it comes to, well, why don't you see more district attorneys, more state attorneys, more attorneys general, more prosecutors going after Scientology? That's a different answer. And by the way, I think you will see federal prosecutors and state prosecutors, once they believe they have enough evidence and what they consider to be as close to an airtight case as possible, I think we will see those. I am very optimistic about that. And I think it is those prosecutions and those criminal convictions that will open the door to Scientology's tax-exempt status being revoked, will open the door to congressional hearings into Scientology's tax-exempt status, will open the door to legislators putting pressure on the IRS to review and revoke Scientology's tax-exempt status. Civil lawsuits are a different matter. Now, aside from personal, just not wanting the headache of being involved in litigation against Scientology, for those who may not know, Scientologists routinely and regularly have to sign enrollment agreements. Every time they start a new major service, a new major course, a new major auditing action, they are supposed to sign, again, Scientology's general services enrollment agreement and release or something like that. There's a few different forms that they sign. And the general release has a clause that is an arbitration clause, where a Scientologist basically agrees to take any and all disputes forever to internal religious arbitration and not be allowed to take any complaints to the courts. And this arbitration clause is what gets used to torpedo most litigation against Scientology by former Scientologists. And some of the lawsuits that succeeded early on, Larry Wollersheim, for example, Lawrence Wollersheim, that lawsuit predated Scientology's use of these enrollment agreements, predated Scientology's arbitration agreement clause. That's one of the reasons that Larry Wollersheim's lawsuit was able to move forward. So if we look at some of the, I said there's 5 lawsuits right now, and 3 of them have pretty much been derailed. 2 of them have been derailed specifically because of this arbitration clause. Leah Remini's lawsuit, I'd have to refresh my memory on Leah Remini's lawsuit. Was not derailed due to the arbitration clause because she's suing for things that happened after she publicly left Scientology, and so that arbitration agreement was not valid. Her lawsuit's being derailed on anti-SLAPP issues and other issues, but mostly anti-SLAPP issues. The 2 lawsuits that are moving forward very nicely right now, one is the Bixler lawsuit, which again is a lawsuit for things that happened after everyone in that lawsuit left Scientology. The Bixler lawsuit has to do with some of Danny Masterson's victims and spouses of the victims, suing for harassment and intimidation that they've been subjected to since coming forward. I think it was as of 2016. So again, the arbitration clause was not relevant. And the other lawsuit that's moving forward nicely is Jane Doe versus Gavin Potter, David Miscavige, Bridge Publications, Church of Scientology. And that that's an interesting one as well, because it's one in which they've already cleared the arbitration clause. And I'd have to refresh my memory. As I sit here right now, I can't specifically remember how they were able to clear that. But so those are the structural reasons. The structural reasons is mostly arbitration clause. And yeah. So if people go, okay, so why don't you want to personally sue Scientology? Why? For me personally, I would go, okay, so what would I be hoping to accomplish? What would be the likelihood of succeeding? What would I benefit from it? And what would be the downsides? I guess on a civil lawsuit, what you're suing for monetary damages. And so that would be the upside. And you go, okay, so what would the monetary damages be? How much would they be? How many years of litigation would it take to would that lawsuit result in a settlement, or would it result in a jury trial? Those are really the only 2 options, right? If you've got a civil lawsuit going, those are really the only 2 options. A financial settlement or a jury trial resulting in what you would hope is an even larger financial reward, judgment. And I just go, to be tied up in litigation, have everything you do for the next 5 to 10 years be under a microscope, have your friends and your family members potentially dragged into depositions, to have all of your correspondence scrutinized. I guess personally I go, I don't know, that doesn't feel worth it to me. And I have to assume that if that's how I feel, that's how a lot of other people would feel as well. Also, a lot of people tend to feel, it's easy to go, what happened to me wasn't that bad, what happened to other people was so much worse. I think everybody actually feels that way. And I know I certainly feel that way. And so I go, yeah, that's just how I feel. This is only my effort to answer this question for myself, because everyone's going to have their own answer. It's very hard for me to even casually look over and see the live chat on this. Let me see if I can. I'll try. Someone says, I don't understand how arbitration stands. If an employer tried that BS, it wouldn't hold up in court. I think you'd be surprised how much arbitration agreements would hold up in court. Because realize, when you're talking about arbitration agreements, you're talking about civil litigation. And when you're talking about civil litigation, you're by definition talking about non-criminal matters. An arbitration agreement is only applicable, to the best of my knowledge, to civil matters. If the police or prosecutors, if the government was going to get involved and the government was going to prosecute Scientology, arbitration agreements are totally out the window. They're irrelevant, right? The government has not agreed to arbitrate with Scientology. It's only former Scientologists. And so, like, if despite any arbitration agreements any of us has signed, that does not prevent us. Arbitration agreements, non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement agreements, none of those things would prevent any Scientologist from participating and cooperating with actual criminal investigations, criminal proceedings. And so, the courts, when it comes to arbitration agreements, the courts are very, very much in favor of arbitration agreements and do not like invalidating them. It sets a bad precedent. Those arbitration agreements exist not only to, make it easier for companies and organizations to stay out of the courts, but they also exist to help ease the burden of the courts themselves. So the courts like arbitration agreements. They love them. They absolutely love them. And even in crazy situations like what's come up with the Baxter Paris case, where part of their arguments, the arguments that Gawain Baxter, Laura Baxter, and Valeska Paris made to try to invalidate the arbitration agreements is, we signed these under duress. We had no choice. Not signing them would have resulted in us being expelled from the group. We would have lost our family. And the court basically upheld Supreme Court precedent that said only the arbitration panel itself can hear your argument and determine whether this arbitration agreement was signed under duress, which sounds insane to any normal thinking person. You're like, wait. The argument that it was signed under duress is supposed to mean don't make us do the arbitration because we didn't willingly agree to this. But then the court's like, well, I'm going to make you go to the thing you're saying you didn't willingly agree to, so that those people who are inherently biased against you can decide actually signed it under duress or not. This is how much courts are biased in favor of arbitration agreements. And it's batshit crazy. Absolutely batshit crazy. But that's what I'm saying. When you said if your employer tried this, it wouldn't hold up, I'm going to have to disagree. If your employer tried this, it most certainly would hold up, to the best of my knowledge, and based on the evidence that's there. Let's see, I still got 40 miles until I got to get off this freeway. Let's see what's going on. I knew an independent arbitrator, which is much different than a Scientology arbitrator. Yeah, this is something that I personally would like to learn more about and understand better. Normal arbitration, to the best of my knowledge, but I say to the best of my knowledge, and that's what I mean. I would like to actually learn more about this. Normal arbitration is done by an independent, unbiased arbitrator. It's someone like a retired judge or whatever. And that's where this religious arbitration comes into play. And this is where the problem is that this is a perfect example of how the specific type of religious tax exemption that Scientology has from the IRS gives it a level of protection that is very burdensome. The courts aren't even allowed to try and determine whether Scientology's arbitration process is fair, because it's an internal religious arbitration. And therefore, Scientology can claim that the policies that govern this process, by the way, there aren't any policies that govern this process, because L. Ron Hubbard didn't even ever write anything about religious arbitration. This is purely a sort of corporate veil scam. But Scientology can tell the courts that such and such policies about committees of evidence, which is the Scientology justice procedure, the policies about the committees of evidence govern religious arbitration, and the courts are not allowed to interpret those policies because that would, separation of state, and the state is not allowed to determine or even not allowed to try and interpret religious policies, and they're not. In order to determine whether this process was fair, you would have to interpret the policies, and that's against the law. And so the court hands are tied. Even though a judge looking at this can casually go, yeah, this is obviously unfair and unbiased, but I'm not allowed to make that decision. That's how crazy this is. And that, all of this is part of the answer of why aren't more people suing Scientology. I'm actually surprised, by the way, these law firms that are representing the former Scientologists who are suing, these law firms are doing it on contingency. These former Scientologists aren't having to pay for the legal bills. I'm actually surprised that law firms continue to roll the dice on this and actually go to bat for these former Scientologists. It's amazing. It's honorable. It's admirable. It's these law firms that have continued to step up. And I guess, whenever one of these huge, powerful, famous law firms steps up, I always go, geez, they must know something. They must know something. They must know something that's not obvious to the rest of us. They must know something that causes them to believe they've got a decent chance of succeeding on this. Otherwise, they're not going to spend thousands of hours and millions of dollars of expense and years and years and years on this litigation. They're making a calculated risk. They're calculating the risk and making a calculated decision there. And I'm always excited when I see a law firm step forward and agree to represent another former Scientologist in one of these cases. So you have to have that magical formula of a Scientologist, former Scientologist, who's willing to experience what it feels like to be wrapped up in Scientology litigation for years. I'm not willing to experience that. So you got to have that magical formula of a former Scientologist who's willing to experience that, matched up with one of these big name law firms who's willing to take on the risk of the cost and the expense, and those are the same thing, really. The cost, the expense, the work hours, it's all one and the same. For a roll of the dice on whether it's going to work. And that's why you don't see more people suing Scientology. That's the answer. That is the answer. Let's see. 30 more miles. Let's see if I can see anything there. They know if they do win, it will be a huge win financially. And in winning, okay, the car is saying, look at the road, damn it. Yeah. So anyway, I get your point. They're taking that calculated risk that, see, by the way, that's how safe these cars are. Even though this car is driving itself right now, it can tell if I take my eyes off the road, and it will reprimand me accordingly. Yes, obviously the law firms believe that here's what the law firms know from looking at the history. Scientology's never won a jury trial in its entire existence. Scientology, once they've exhausted all possible means to avoid trial, when they are finally confronted with the prospect of going to trial, they will spend an almost unlimited amount of money to settle that case, to keep it out of the court, to keep it out of the court, out of the jury, out of in front of a jury. That is the calculation that these law firms are making. And I'm glad that some of them are willing to step up, because it's true. Scientology's never won a jury trial in its existence, and once it has exhausted all possible means and appeals to get the lawsuit derailed and avoid trial, once they've exhausted all those options, they will write a check with an unlimited amount of money to settle that lawsuit. And I hope that's what happens with at least 2 or 3 of these lawsuits. Like I said, two of them, maybe 3 of them, have been totally derailed at this point. 2 of them are moving forward nicely, and I hope to see a big old pound of flesh, many pounds of flesh, taken out of Scientology. Whether that's in the form of a huge settlement or whether that's in the form of a jury trial and massive judgments, I hope that's how it goes. And then I hope the feds step up, and some state prosecutors step up, some federal prosecutors step up, and finally go after Scientology for covering up child SA, the hundreds of millions of dollars of credit card fraud, bank fraud, wired fraud, identity theft. I think it's going to be a really bad 5 years for Scientology. The next 5 years in the courts are going to be really bad, I think. But yeah. Anyway, I hope that's been a little helpful. After I hit my first stop here, I'll probably have another 150 miles to go or something. I should be in Miami by about 4:30. There's a whole bunch of people ready to get on this boat and set sail tomorrow. So I hope to hang out for a few hours before turning around and driving back to Clearwater. I guess my point is I might do another video before I get to Miami. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. Thanks for keeping it safe with me. I'll talk